Recently, I had the pleasure of talking to Angelica Galante from McGill University in Canada. Originally from Brazil, her work focuses on social justice, inclusive education, and critical sociolinguistics. In this interview, we talk about plurilingualism, language and culture, and how teachers and students can take advantage of their existing language resources to learn new languages better. This is an edited version of our interview. If you would like to listen to the full version, you will find a link down in the description box, where you will also find a link to Angelica's website, which is full of plurilingual teaching resources. I hope you enjoy it. Before we can start to talk about some of your work specifically, I think we actually need to learn some kind of new vocabulary, because there's some words that maybe English learners and maybe even some English teachers are just not familiar with, and those words would be plurilingualism and translanguaging. So could you just give a kind of brief overview of what those words mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say where the two constructs are right now, because they are still being developed. And as we move forward with research, we will probably continue to develop the two concepts. Both plurilingualism and translanguaging are both a theory and also practice. So theoretically, the two constructs, they developed separately and from different epistemologies, so from different origins, let's put it this way. So plurilingualism, both actually originated in Europe, but plurilingualism comes more from a policy. It's more policy oriented, where the Council of Europe and European Union would like to have European citizens speaking multiple languages so that they can, travel around and communicate with different people. But also the fact that there are a lot of immigrants moving to European countries, so it's also applied in language teaching. So it's the idea of validating people's linguistic and cultural repertoires, but also teaching them the target language, whatever language it is, right? If it's in Greece, they're going to be learning Greek. If it's in the UK, it's going to be English. Translanguaging also originated in Europe, in Wales, and it was more from a grassroots approach. It wasn't a policy approach. So it was mainly originated with the idea of using using two languages actually, Welsh and English, to make sense of texts in bilingual education typically. So using language to read a text and then making a summary in Welsh, for example, so that you would develop competency in both languages. Now, this is the origin. However, how they are applied in language teaching and language research nowadays, they are very similar. In fact, sometimes people say that translanguaging and plurilingualism go hand in hand. There may be a few differences. For example, plurilingualism also takes into account pluriculturalism, so all the cultures or cultural backgrounds that people have within themselves, not necessarily one culture, or even the idea of culture is, it's not the culture that we think about museum or art or anything. It's about values, customs, things that people believe in, how people behave, etc., etc. And not necessarily thinking that one culture is better than the other. Of course, there is no such a thing. Whereas translanguaging does not necessarily highlight this area. It's mostly in language, right? Now, within a plurilingual approach, translanguaging is also one of the approaches that is used in the classroom. So I like to say that plurilingualism could be an umbrella where there are several different pedagogical approaches, and translanguaging would be one of them. So translanguaging is getting students to use the languages that they know to make sense of a new language, for example. So if you have, let's say, two students in your classroom, one speaks Spanish as a first language and one speaks Chinese as a first language, and they're both in the same class learning English. So you're going to make sure to come up with pedagogical materials that engage these students in the languages that they already know to make sense of a new language. So in this case, it would be English. But that doesn't mean that they are going to be using their L1 only. L1 is the first language, right? So it could be that those students, Chinese students, for example, in China, it's an understatement to say Chinese is the only language that Chinese people speak, because we have several variations, several dialects, depending on the region that you come from. So it's important to engage students in not only using, but also thinking about all of those languages and variations while they're learning a new language. Let's see, a very simple example would be if you have a list of vocabulary. So getting students not only to match vocabulary with the definition, but also asking them to think about that particular vocabulary in their first language or second language or variations, right? Many times students are able to make connections in meaning between those languages. They may make connections in pronunciation. They may make connections in morphology. They may not make connections at all. It could be that some words don't have an equivalent in another language, right? So the word in Portuguese, for example, saudades, which means when you miss someone a lot, I cannot think of any word in English, for example, to represent that particular word. So you would have to explain what saudade means instead of, just translating it. Now, through this reflection and through this awareness, students are able, that's my hypothesis, actually. I have to do more research on that to see if that's true. My hunch is that students are able to, they do make these connections or not, and they are able to remember the word or retrieve the word in the new language better than if they didn't have all those discussions and all that reflection. So, and to learn a language, awareness is extremely important. Without awareness, it's very difficult to actually acquire a new language. So having this process of not only discussion, sometimes it could be discussion with a peer where both are talking about their languages. One can actually teach the other person a little bit of their language. That doesn't mean that the language is the target language, right? You're not teaching that particular language, but you are not only allowing the students to use those languages, but encouraging students to make those connections among the languages. So plurilingualism, in a way, it's not only about a monolingual competence, it's about building that plurilingual competence of being aware of multiple languages, but not necessarily speaking all of those languages fluently, but at least having an awareness, having some knowledge, and respecting and validating those languages.
It's funny because, if when you look at the concept, it makes perfect sense. And in fact, the concept is backed up by all of the neuroscience that shows that language in the brain is basically all connected. The brain is a machine that's designed to make connections between concepts and ideas and categories and all of that. But I know that right now there are students and especially teachers, maybe if they're from an older generation as well, who are saying, wait a minute, as far as I know, we have to always use English in the classroom. We should never break this monolingual instruction, and this goes against this kind of core idea that monolingual is the only way and the best way to teach and learn a language.
Absolutely. It's not an easy thing to do. I don't blame language teachers, because that's how the field of language education and applied linguistics or SLA, second language acquisition, has been developed on a monolingual traditions, right? Because that's what was believed that would, make people learn a new language. Now, one of the research projects that I have actually is to get teachers engaging in teacher education on plurilingual approaches, because honestly, in Canada at least, or in other contexts, even in EFL contexts, populations are very diverse. It's almost impossible to get one particular community where you're going to have native speakers of one language only. And even if you do, they are definitely exposed to, TV, internet, right? When we get the youth now, that not only do they engage on internet, etc., but they play games, they read manga, they watch Korean drama, they listen to K-pop. It's it's a phenomenon that they're already exposed to it. So since they're already exposed to it, let's use the knowledge that you have in that particular area, and leverage, language learning and teaching and building this plurilingual and pluricultural competence. Because at the end of the day, it's important for society to have people who respect different languages. They provide value to those languages and cultures, instead of, oh, you speak French, like here there is this division between French and English. Not as much as there used to be, but I'm a francophone. Oh no, I am an anglophone. Oh, you are an allophone. Allophone is a term used here for people who don't speak English or French, as if people didn't speak any language at all. And in order for you to consider yourself an anglophone, you have to speak English as a native speaker. So even though I speak English, I'm not considered an anglophone. So if I speak French, so if I develop French, I'm not going to be considered a francophone either. So what am I? I'm going to be an allophone for the rest of my life. Or even students who have an ESL background, right? We have a tendency to say, oh, this person has an ESL background, to say that they're not a native speaker. So once you have an ESL background, you're going to have an ESL background forever, because even if you take Cambridge exams, TOEFL exams, IELTS exams, people will always label you as you are a non-native speaker of that particular language. So we have to stop that. That's it's about time that we, and I speak about this very passionately, of course, because I'm biased. But even in the first language, right? I don't even know what my first language is, but Portuguese is one of the languages that are dominant in me, Portuguese and English. But even in Portuguese, or in any language, we have a tendency to say, oh, my accent or the variety I speak has more status than yours, or discriminate against other people because they speak in one way or another way. So linguistic discrimination comes because of this monolingual ideology that we have, collected through years and years and years of experience.
Yeah, and I sort of see a lot of times, like, this linguistic discrimination. I definitely feel like it's one of the last acceptable prejudices. Like, we've evolved as a culture to not, discriminate against, skin color and gender and these kind of things. But, when it comes to language, it's like we're living in the 18th century sometimes, right?
Yes. And policies in many countries, they are very discriminatory. One of the policies here in Quebec, for example, mandates that people use French and French only, and French should be the language of work, language of study, language of identity. Like, whoa, so now we have policies mandating how people identify because of colonial legacy.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that I love about language is that no matter how hard these kind of bodies, no matter how hard they try to to sort of contain and constrain language. Language always has a way of saying, well, no, actually, I'm going to do what I want anyway. So
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is the beauty of language, and how language, develops in societies, and how language policies try to suppress that particular
yes.
action.
Yes, and what's interesting is even though I know that you said that at the moment you have this kind of hypothesis, but your doctoral thesis, which was about the difference between plurilingual or monolingual instructions in a Canadian university program, it actually showed real results. For example, it showed an increase in pluricultural awareness, cognitive development, empathy, and relatability. So, they're real tangible results. It's not just some sort of abstract theory, right?
Not at all, not at all. And I was very interested. It's interesting that this project developed out of my own skepticism, because at the time that I was doing my PhD, I was reading a lot about plurilingualism and translanguaging and cross-linguistic pedagogies. And at the time there were few studies actually comparing plurilingual approaches to monolingual approaches. And then I thought, well, I don't even believe in this plurilingual approach anyways. Let's see how better it is or not, right? Because it's important to verify and collect data, really, on empirical data, to see what works and what doesn't work. And I was very interested in investigating what worked from a pedagogical perspective, but also from the student's perspective. So I gathered data from both teachers and students. So the study that I conducted, I recruited teachers, English teachers, teachers who were teaching English for academic purposes. So this is a program at a university in Ontario, which is an English-dominated context. And I asked them to use plurilingual approaches in one group and monolingual approaches, things that they were already doing, in a second group. So luckily, each teacher was teaching two groups of students, so they would use plurilingual approaches with one and monolingual approaches with another one. So the content was very similar, was pretty much the same. For example, they had to teach idioms. So they were teaching the same idioms in a monolingual approach, matching, doing role plays, etc., and teaching idioms in a plurilingual approach. So the plurilingual one, so they were teaching students how to engage them with their languages. So many times students would go to the board and write down idioms in their languages, compare, English with Turkish, with Russian, compare meaning. I remember during the classroom observation, one Chinese student talked about the idiom "shoot for the stars," that has a very good connotation in English, that, we should dream, and dream high and big. And in Chinese, they have a similar idiom, but the meaning is very different. The meaning is like, whoa, you're not being modest, so you shouldn't be using that idiom as much, or culturally, it doesn't fit, right? So if students are not making those connections, they might even be using the word "shoot for the stars" in English, but with a Chinese meaning. You know what I mean? So, and these conversations do not happen in a monolingual framework. If you are teaching English and teaching English only, and not engaging students in those kinds of reflections or experiences in class, they're not going to be making those connections. Not to talk about pragmatics and vocabulary, et cetera. So
yeah, well, actually, you have created a website which is full of teaching resources, which is called "Breaking the Invisible Wall." And I'm curious. Well, you explained a little bit, but I'm curious about why you feel like that is an invisible wall.
Well, I named the website because of something that a student of mine actually said. Way back when I was already trying to use plurilingual approaches and getting students to talk about their culture, there was an activity that I asked students, and these were students who were international students studying English here in Canada. And some of these students were placed in host families. And one of the students, well, I don't remember exactly what what the task was, but I had students talk about difficulties that they had in Canadian society, generally speaking, in terms of discrimination or in terms of people who do not understand the way they behave or the way they speak. And one of the things that the student the student said was that in his homestay, he was not allowed to cook Korean food. He was from Korea because his host family thought it was smelly and, full of, prejudice against his own food, and he didn't have access to this and he didn't have access to that. And he said, it's very difficult to talk to my family as if there was an invisible wall between me and them because of our cultural backgrounds. And when he talked about the invisible wall, and that was, before Trump, we weren't even talking about Trump at that time. And then through the conversations we had in class and through scenario building, then we had some drama exercises. He managed to use some of the drama scenarios at home to actually not confront the host family, but try to explain to the host family what food meant for him. Because the relationship between food and Korean culture is very strong. So for him, not being able to cook Korean food was pretty much taking away from his identity as a Korean person. And that hit him hard. So then he came back to school and he said, oh yeah, I tried some of the drama exercises at home and it actually worked. I am able to cook my food now and it's as if the invisible wall was broken. And I was like, wow, can I use that for my website? Because I was in the process of creating the tasks already. And he was very happy to say yes, of course. So, so the website has a few resources, but mainly the tasks that were used in the study that I conducted during my PhD. So especially the plurilingual ones. I didn't include the monolingual ones because everybody knows what it is, but if people are interested in looking at both, they can look at my thesis. It's online and both are there, or just send me an email and I'll be happy to share.
And I think something that's really interesting to me, and something that nobody really talks about in the world of language teaching, is the importance of culture. And I think what's really nice about the concept of plurilingualism is that it takes into account culture as almost an integral part of classroom learning. I mean, how important do you think that culture is in the language learning process?
I have just finished conducting a study that I was. It's a validation process of a scale that has language and culture together, plurilingualism and pluriculturalism, because I was interested in knowing if they would be separate constructs or one construct. And that has to do with language and culture, right? So I thought, well, perhaps going to be two different constructs because they are unrelated. We can totally see language and culture separately. But in all the tests that I had that I have done, in all of them, language and culture are very integrated. So that speaks a lot to how we teach language, and we don't talk much about the culture, that comes together with that language, right? So, for example, if you're teaching people how to write in one particular language. So in English, we have the topic sentence. Then we have, the five paragraph essay? Forget already. Or thesis statement, as if in every language we would write that way, right? So then we have, Chinese speakers of English using a lot of metaphor, talking about flowers to actually mean society. And then English speakers who only speak English, they go like, whoa, I don't understand this. That's wrong. But, it's not wrong. It's just that, the culture has not been explored in both ways, right? Because it's not a one-way thing. It has to go both ways. And English teachers, I'm making a very broad statement, but we are taught, like when we take TESOL programs, teaching certificates, we're taught to use one language only. And we teach from the assumption that the language is connected to one particular dominant culture, which is the academic culture, or the standard English culture, whichever standard that is. And we rarely get students to talk about their own culture and how they write or how they speak, how they do presentations in their languages. What's the relationship at home, how they actually communicate with their parents. Do they communicate with their parents, So, and then if we expect people to be behaving in that particular dominant culture, we have to open up. Well, first of all, we shouldn't have that expectation. But second, we have to open up the discussion, and teachers are not taught how to do that. So I don't blame teachers. I don't even blame one person. It's the field, how it has been developed, and how our societies have been developed too, right? So we need change.
Yeah, I mean, is that kind of a little thing that students can sort of start to incorporate from this approach? Is starting to integrate some culture with some language learning?
Absolutely, and being very open to cultures too. Because if we start learning a language, any language, thinking that, oh, this culture is weird, or, oh, people in this culture do this, that's so awkward. Oh, why do they do that? Well, first you have to deconstruct your own biases. That if the language, or even language, oh, in French we have gender for, like, if you're going to say table, the table has gender. Oh, this is so awkward. Well, this is a different type of language. So you just first of all, you have to accept the language and the culture, how people behave, how people engage in social actions, and learn from them, because that's something that we are missing a lot in language teaching, learning a language from the cultural aspect.
What is the main change that you would like to see in the world of language teaching, over the next 10 years?
I would like to see teachers engaging more with the linguistic and cultural resources that students already have. I would like to see people recognizing this as valuable. I would like to see people engaging in learning, not only from a teacher-student perspective, but also learn from the students. We have a tendency to think that teachers deposit, it's the banking idea from Paulo Freire, right? That you deposit the knowledge and you don't learn anything from the students. And in language teaching, it's such a great opportunity for teachers to actually learn from the students. Not only learn concepts, but also learn a few words in other languages, learn different perspectives. We need more of that in our world. And thinking about that, the idea of social justice in language teaching. Why are we teaching that particular language? Why are we teaching students to speak like a native speaker if this only, corroborates for linguistic discrimination? So I would really like to see teachers reflecting on those big ideas, because sometimes we don't do much about that, because on the day-to-day we have our lesson. Okay, I have to cover simple present and present perfect in one lesson. Sometimes we don't have time for that, but even when we come up with examples with the present perfect, can we include an example that has a social meaning and engages students into deeper discussions? Because that's something that we really need in the world in terms of not only language teaching, but in anything, really.
Wow, awesome. Well, Angelica Galante, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.